Imagine spending more than 27 years in prison for a murder that you didn't commit. That's exactly what happened to Willie Veasy, the man that you see there. And when he was finally released last year, like other wrongfully convicted men and women in Pennsylvania, he wasn't compensated for all of those years that he spent behind bars. And now his lawyers want to change that. They filed a civil rights complaint. NBC10's Lauren Mayk has the details and why he has to go back to court in order to get compensated.
Flashback to January 1992. One man killed, another man shot in North Philadelphia. Months later, Willie Veasy is arrested and ultimately convicted of murder. Police and prosecutors at the time use eyewitness testimony and a signed confession to seal Veasy's fate. Willie has always claimed innocence. Jump to October 2019. Willie is exonerated for the crime.
Willie Veasy was the victim of a wrongful conviction.
Now his lawyers want the city to pay for the more than 27 years he spent wrongfully behind bars. They filed this federal civil rights complaint outlining their case. David Radovsky is one of Veasy's attorneys.
And we're prepared to prove not only did he not get a fair trial, but that he's factually innocent.
The complaint contends in part officials coerced a fabricated confession from Veasy, saying, quote, the interrogating detectives told an exhausted Mr. Veasy they had written down his exculpatory statement and, once he signed it, he would be out of there, which Mr. Veasy understood to mean they would let him go home. Mr. Veasy signed the written document without reading it, unquote. Veasy's lawyers also say evidence that may have helped clear him was not shared with the original defense team.
It turned out that the detectives hid exculpatory evidence. There were other suspects who were named by witnesses. That's information that has to be turned over to a defendant.
The complaint also points to similar cases from the late 1980s and early 1990s that have now ended with exonerations, including Anthony Wright, Sean Thomas, Walter Ogrod, and others.
But when you step back and look at the larger picture and say, look, this wasn't just some isolated case where somebody made a mistake and maybe overstepped, but it seems to be a kind of practice and custom right in the department.
According to a recent report by the National Registry of Exonerations that looked at more than 2,000 cases from across the country, quote, official misconduct contributed to the false convictions of 54% of defendants who were later exonerated, unquote. Samuel Gross started the registry and co-authored the report.
The most common type of misconduct was concealing exculpatory evidence, which could be anything from a confession or a DNA test that proves that someone else did the crime, to evidence that one of the witnesses for the prosecution gave an inconsistent statement, said the opposite of what he testified to at another occasion.
But in Pennsylvania, just because you get exonerated doesn't mean you get compensated for time spent behind bars.
Unfortunately, Pennsylvania is one of a few states that has no compensation for people who've been wrongfully convicted.
That means the only way to get paid is to file a federal civil rights case. Attorneys tell us these cases can be hard to win because not every wrongful conviction involves a civil rights violation. But since 2013, the city of Philadelphia has paid out more than $22.4 million in 7 exoneration cases, including almost $10 million to Anthony Wright and more than $4 million to Sean Thomas. The city has no comment on the pending Veasy litigation.
The only remedy or compensation he has at this point is a civil rights suit for damages, right? The 27 years of imprisonment that he suffered. That's the only remedy our system gives somebody like Willie Veasy.
For the investigators, I'm Lauren Mayk, NBC10 News.
Pennsylvania State Representative Christopher Rabb tells us that he plans to introduce a compensation bill for the wrongfully convicted as early as December. The Philadelphia Police Department began video recording homicide suspect interviews back in 2016, and the officers that were involved in Veasy's case have previously declined to comment.